What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are continuing to talk about the June 2024 rules update to Warhammer 40k. In previous videos, I deep dove into some updated rules, including the updated rules for stratagems, as well as brand new movement mechanics for the game. And today we're going to be going through all of the remainder of the core and mission rules that have been changed in this update. And while I will discuss very briefly the changes that were made to movement and stratagems, if you want a more in-depth look at the implications of those changes and the exact mechanics that changed, you can go check out those other videos. But without further ado, let's dive in. Now, movement was updated so that models can move through any area with space for their base. Pivoting is now free for models mounted on circular bases and costs 2 inches of movement for other models. When this 2 inches of movement is paid, that allows free pivoting for the remainder of that move, allowing that unit to spin around as much as it wants while it's making that movement. At other points during a movement, models have to move in straight lines and can't change their facing, so that pivot mechanic must be used if you want to spin your model at all. In addition, when you're piling in and consolidating, models that have a 0-inch pivot value, those are the models that are mounted on round bases, can rotate even if they're base to base with enemy. This will likely only matter to change line of sight or model placement when you're trying to pile in or consolidate models around a particularly wide model. Stratagems also got a ton of changes, including a bunch of small erratas and updates to many core stratagems. Again, check out my stratagem video where I break down all of those changes in specific. There were also some updates to styles of stratagems, such as a nerf to lone operative style stratagems that make you untargetable by ranged attacks outside of 12 inches. That was increased to 18 inches for those effects, and reinforcement style stratagems like the reinforcements stratagem in Astra Militarum, which can only be used once per game now. Rites of battle and other free stratagem effects were reworked as well. They now only reduce the cost of a stratagem by 1 instead of making it entirely free, and stratagems can only be duplicated by effects like Rites of Battle, which otherwise would allow you to use a stratagem even if it had already been used in that same phase, if the ability duplicating the stratagem specifically names the stratagem that you're copying. So most duplicated stratagem effects will no longer work. With these changes, we also saw a removal of the requirements that effects like these work only on battle tactic stratagems, and there were some old requirements that sort of fell by the wayside. For example, using free stratagem or stratagem duplication abilities on stratagems that targeted multiple units. With the update, those restrictions were removed, so you can use a free stratagem, or in this case, a stratagem discounting effect on stratagems that target 2 units, for example. Similarly, CP tax effects or Agents of Vect style effects were also rewritten. Now, any unit that has an effect that would once per game target an enemy stratagem that is used and increase its points cost has that ability replaced on their datasheet with a new aura that increases the use of all stratagems targeting enemy units within 12 inches of them by 1, making them much more aggressive and offensive at projecting their anti-stratagem effects. They're not able to sit in the back end of the table and do it passively. However, it does require you to play them in a more dangerous position. Now moving on to new stuff that we haven't talked about yet. This is in that core rules update document, and we'll start with redeployments. Redeployments have been unified to always resolve after the deploy army step. Now, in each individual faction errata, most redeployment abilities have been changed to now occur in the new step of the game that's been included in Pariah Nexus, the redeploy unit step that occurs after armies are deployed but before the first turn roll-off happens. This means that units like the Phobos Captain, for example, that used to redeploy units after first turn had been determined, now no longer do so, making these styles of redeployment effects significantly less useful. There have also been some changes to shooting eligibility. The firing deck ability, which is the ability that allows transports with embarked units to use the weapons of those units to attack, can now no longer allow a unit to fire twice in a turn. There were some niche cases where this could happen. For example, if you had the ability to move after shooting, a good example was a Space Marine Eliminator Squad. They could shoot their guns, then use their own ability ability to move, and at the end of that move, embark into an open-topped transport. The transport could then use its firing deck ability to shoot those models' weapons again. The firing deck can now no longer be used to fire the weapons of a unit that has already fired. So once that last fusel shot goes off, its cell is expended for the remainder of that phase. In addition, a model whose weapon was chosen to be fired with firing deck cannot be selected to fire later on in that same phase. There were some very specific instances where you could have a transport be destroyed after firing with its firing deck, then disembark the unit inside, and because they hadn't fired yet, choose them to shoot. If enemies had reactive fire effects, or you are able to kill your own transport with hazardous, for example, there were situations in which you could actually fire multiple times with a unit because of this interaction. That is now no longer the case. If you shot out of a firing deck, you can now no longer be selected to shoot that phase once you're on the table. In addition, a unit that has no eligible targets cannot be selected to shoot. Now, there is a note here that this does not change whether or not they are eligible to shoot. The reason that this is important is because actions in the Pariah Nexus mission document require that a unit is eligible to shoot that turn, which restricts you from, for example, declaring that you're shooting with a unit and then declaring that you're doing an action with that same unit. Because that unit is no longer eligible to shoot, they're also no longer eligible to declare an action. That's why this clarification is important. A unit that has no eligible targets is still eligible to shoot, but simply can't be selected. This is important for abilities that trigger when a unit is selected to shoot, and the main one here is Abaddon the Despoiler from Chaos Space Marine. Abaddon, when he makes a Dark Pact check, an ability that triggers when his unit is selected to shoot, has the opportunity to generate command points. In the past, this was used to simply roll random Dark Pact checks for selecting the unit to shoot, but then, since there are no targets to fire at, not selecting any targets and ending the attack sequence. You would still take the Dark Pact check, potentially suffer any damage from that check, but also gain any benefits. That is no longer the case. If Abaddon has line of sight to no enemy models, he can't be selected to shoot, therefore, he cannot generate command points passively. He can no longer celebrate the Dark Gods by firing his bolter in the air. He actually has to fire his bolter at an enemy. The Chaos Gods are incredibly committed to ammunition conservation. Hazardous and Devastating Wounds have both gone through minor reworks. Devastating Wounds is the most important one. At the release of the edition, Devastating Wounds on a critical wound converted their damage into mortal wounds. This ended up being super overpowered because mortal wounds that overkill models continue to apply their damage to other models in the unit, allowing a big damage Devastating Wound effect to essentially spall and hit multiple other models in that same unit. You could kill an entire unit with a single attack from a railgun, for example, that was dealing Devastating Wounds. It was changed so that Devastating Wounds simply ignored all saving throws. However, this meant that a lot of technology that was designed to defend against them by protecting those units against mortal wounds no longer does so. That has now been changed, and the ability has been reworked. When a weapon with Devastating Wounds critically wounds a target, it converts its damage into mortal wound. However, if a model is assigned mortal wounds from that devastating attack, those mortal wounds are capped at the wounds characteristic of the target. So you can never overkill and deal additional damage to a unit over the remaining wounds of whichever model had been assigned the damage. Now, mortal wound protection works against devastating weapons, but devastating weapons can't overkill and carry their damage over to multiple models. Hazardous has a similar effect. A failed hazardous check now deals 3 mortal wounds to the model that failed the test. This has a flowchart associated with it that we'll talk about in a sec, but instead of just killing a model outright from the unit, these mortal wounds are treated essentially exactly like the mortal wounds inflicted from devastating damage. That individual model takes those 3 mortal wounds, can use any mortal wound protection it might have, but once destroyed, any additional mortal wounds from that failed hazardous check do not carry over and do not hit another model. Interestingly, the fact that this now does a flat 3 mortal wounds will still kill basically any infantry model that is carrying a hazardous weapon, but there may be some instances in the future where we see 4 wound models that have hazardous weapons, which could now survive a failed hazardous check. This was the case for things like Crisis battlesuits in the past. We were taking cyclic ion blasters. Those had a base of 4 wounds and could fail multiple hazardous checks before dying, but that was because they were vehicles, and vehicles always took 3 damage from failed hazardous checks. Now everybody does that. I guess it also means that mortal wound protection could allow you to survive a failed hazardous check, and then potentially suffer future hazardous checks later on in the game. When a unit fails a hazardous check, you go down a flow chart to determine who suffers the damage from that hazardous check. Only models with hazardous weapons are going to be suffering this damage, and if you have any wounded models with hazardous weapons, they must be assigned the damage from that failed test first. Then, anyone else in the unit who is not a character that has a hazardous weapon can be assigned it. Then, if there are no other models with hazardous weapons remaining in the unit, a character with a hazardous weapon can be assigned the damage. At one point in the past, it was possible for you to assign failed hazardous checks to a character, allowing you to take additional damage over and above what the unit would normally be able to sustain while failing hazardous checks. So, for example, if you had multiple infantry models in a unit with hazardous weapons and a plasma pistol on a 4-wound character, your first failed hazardous check could be assigned to the character, allowing you to preserve your other hazardous weapon-equipped infantry that are also in that unit. That's no longer the case. Those infantry must suffer the damage first, then the character will take it if there are no other hazardous weapons available. Indirect fire has received another change. It now, in addition to suffering -1 to hit when targeting enemies outside of its line of sight, only hits a target on an unmodified 4+, if it can't draw a line of sight to that target, of course. Now, it's important to note that this is simply a failure state for the attack. An unmodified roll is an automatic miss. This is not a hit roll penalty. This means that effects that prevent you from suffering attack roll modifiers or effects that allow you to ignore the hit penalty imposed by indirect fire do not overcome this downside. You can re-roll these hits, so if you have a re-roll effect, you'd potentially be hitting on 4s and then re-rolling, but regardless of how many hit bonuses you have and what other characteristic ignoring effect, those attacks are always still going to miss on a 4-up. This is a huge penalty to indirect fire, and especially high reliability indirect fire that had ways to ignore penalties or buff itself through the -1 to hit. Ruined Terrain also saw some clarifications and a couple of minor changes. Primarch units like Lionel Johnson and Robute Gilliman can now move through ruined walls as if they were infantry. They still aren't infantry, they're classified as monsters, but they can just traverse through walls as if they weren't there, like an infantry model can normally. Belisarius Call also got this treatment. He's still not an infantry model, but he essentially works exactly like an infantry model when it comes to ruined terrain. There was a clarification within the rules commentary section of the document that clarified ruin visibility, and this one created a lot of confusion. It wasn't an actual change, it was just a clarification of the rules, but I'll address it here. It was clarified that for models that are mounted on bases, whether or not they are within the area of a terrain feature, or a ruin in this case, is dependent solely on their base. This was implied by the previous rules, but it was not explicitly stated, and the diagrams in the rules commentary did an absolutely terrible job at showcasing this. Now, a lot of people got this rule confused and thought that you now only cared about their bases when drawing line of sight. This is only to determine how you draw line of sight around a ruin. So, for example, if a model is standing outside of a ruin with no part of its base overlapping the area of that ruin terrain, but part of the model, for example, a wing or a sword, is sticking over the area of that ruin terrain, according to this clarification, it is not considered to be within that terrain feature. So the terrain feature will block line of sight to the model. Likewise, if any part of the model's base is sticking into the terrain feature, because it's then within the terrain feature, the ruin rule does not automatically block line of sight to that model. And to clarify, if a model is not within the terrain feature, but is sticking all the way through it, so that part of its model passes over the terrain feature and extends out the other end, it can both draw line of sight from that point, and line of sight can be drawn to that point as normal. Again, this is what the rules stated previously. It was just the diagrams didn't really explain it very well, and this is clarifying how it is intended to work, which is probably exactly how you were playing before this. Further clarification was given to models that are fighting on death. They now explicitly pile in before being removed. This was implied by the rules and the fighting as individual models rules, but not actually outright stated anywhere, and things were a little bit confusing. Some events actually ruled that you didn't pile in when fighting on death, even though the individual fighting rules said that you did. Now it's been clarified, when you fight on death, you pile in first, then target your attacks resolve your attacks, and then are removed. Vehicles with bases saw a very minor change. So these are vehicles like grav tanks and skimmers that have a base that they are mounted on, but use their hull for determining measurements. These essentially use projection measuring to determine whether or not they're in base contact with another model. They are considered to be within base contact if the model is within 0 inches horizontally and 5 inches vertically of that vehicle. So for example, if the vehicle is extending up and over another model so that it's vertically either in line with that model's base or extending over that model, and the part of that vehicle that is extending over that model is not more than 5 inches up above the ground, they are considered to be in base contact. This just makes combat maneuvering, piling in, and consolidating, for example, much simpler when it comes to models that are hovering slightly over the tabletop. Now, the rules update document has an FAQ section, which has been not only used to present the information in these updates in a little bit more of a legible fashion, and a lot of what it includes is copy and pasted from elsewhere in either the rules commentary or the core rules update. There are some new entries that actually provide new information to the game. First off, fight on target abilities, or abilities that allow a unit to shoot or fight based on a certain criteria, can be triggered infinite times. A good example of this is the Murder Fang ability, which is also shared by things like Death Company Dreadnoughts and the World Eater's Hellbrute. This allows the unit to shoot or fight in response to an enemy unit targeting it, and according to this clarification, can be done every single time that unit is targeted. Elsewhere in the document, however, it has also been clarified that because monster or vehicle units are not eligible to shoot outside their own shooting phase, you are not able to use these effects to shoot if you are engaged in melee. This is another thing that was never actually stated by the rules, so it was a little bit in question and has been clarified. If you're engaged in melee and not in your own shooting phase, you simply cannot make ranged attacks even if you're a monster or a vehicle. You can do so during your own shooting phase as normal, but effects like Overwatch and shooting on target, for example, will not work. Next up, start of phase effects must be resolved before other effects in a phase. This one is kind of self-explanatory, but was never previously stated. This was mostly just an event clarification for almost every event that I was aware of. If you have a stratagem or an ability, for example, that triggers at the start of your phase, you do that first, and then you use your other abilities or stratagems. There are some niche instances where the sequencing of this matters. Thousand Suns, for example, have a bunch of stuff they do at the start of the shooting phase and must do that before they do their normal shooting phase stuff or use their other stratagems, but it's nice to have that clarified in the core rules. Characteristic modifiers got their whole section. There are now listed caps for modifiers, which, to be fair, was true for the previous rules commentary. This is just a nicer way to present them. It has been clarified, however, that the order that they are applied is determined by the active player. The example given is an incredibly spicy one. Let's say, for example, that you have a Norn emissary that is in range of its selected objective marker, making it objective control 15. However, it then becomes battle shocked. If you're the active player, you can choose to resolve the effect of battle shock first, making it OC 0, then choose to apply the characteristic replacement from its ability, making it OC 15 instead, allowing it during your turn to ignore the biggest downside of being battle shocked. However, once it comes to your opponent's turn, they'll choose to do the opposite thing and make it OC 0 again. So it only really comes into play for scoring your own objectives. Speaking of which, objectives did get a clarification. Now, all effects are resolved at the end of a turn before victory points are scored. This is generally how it worked previously, but it means that, for example, objectives are created from the ritual mission, control over objectives is established, then any relevant victory points are scored. Previously, this would require the player to state the order in which they wanted those effects to resolve, and that would always basically be the same thing. You wanted to create all your objectives and sequence things in such a way that all of your objectives score before then moving on to the step at which you score them. But now it's just codified that it does work this way all the time. Speaking of effect sequencing, 40k has traditionally been incredibly terrible at determining the order in which optional effects are declared. Let's say, for example, it's the start of your shooting phase, and both you and your opponent have abilities that you can turn on during that phase. You have an effect at the start of the shooting phase that enhances your attacks, and your opponent has an ability that enhances their defense. Whether or not either one of you is using that ability can dramatically change your decision to use that ability. So what order is that decision made? Previously, nobody knew. It was never actually addressed, and in some instances, this was very important. The core rules have a section on effect sequencing, but it only governs the resolution of effects, not the declaration of optional effects. However, that has been changed. Now, the active player always declares their effects first during their turn. So if you're the player that has an effect that can buff your ranged attacks, for example, you must tell your opponent that you are activating that ability first. Then your opponent, at the start of that phase, can use, for example, the Custodian Warden's ability in response to that to then use their 4+ Feel No Pain. Once all of those effects are declared, if the order in which they resolve matters, the active player will choose the order in which they resolve, per the core rules. Then you'll go to your actual shooting phase and you'll start shooting with people. This doesn't affect, for example, stratagems that are used before a unit goes to shoot, or stratagems that are used when a unit is targeted. If these abilities resolve at another time, for example, at the start of the battle round, effects like the Orc Wah, the players roll off, and the loser of that roll-off declares the use of their abilities first. That was a lot of complicated talking to describe an effect that will probably come up in a very marginal number of games. But you know what? I'm excited that it's finally been clarified in the rules for the 1 in 10 games that it does come into play. Next up, a battle-shocked unit will still be affected by a stratagem that was used before it became battle-shocked. So for example, if you use Armor of Contempt in response to an enemy attack against you, and then later on in that phase, something forces you to roll a battle-shock check, an Infernus Marine squad shoots you, for example, and you fail that battle shock check, your Armor of Contempt will still apply. This is a reversal of previous rules where you simply couldn't be affected by stratagems at all while you were battle shocked. Instead, being quote-unquote affected by stratagems basically just refers to being targeted by stratagems. So battle shocked units can still benefit from stratagems, but can't be targeted by them, is, to my reading, the implication of this rules change. Now, last but certainly not least, before we move off of this document, hazardous checks from psychic weapons have gotten a little bit of a clarification. If you fail a hazardous check from a psychic weapon, that now counts as damage from a psychic attack. Previously, it was just damage from the hazardous weapon ability, essentially, but psychic attacks were specifically mortal wounds dealt by psychic abilities, or the attacks of weapons with the psychic keyword. Now, if a weapon has that psychic keyword and deals you 3 mortal wounds for failing it, you can use anti-psychic weapon effects to reduce that damage. For example, psychic hoods on librarians can be used to mitigate incoming damage from a failed hazardous check on a smite, for example. This is a little bit of a quality of life change for librarians, and honestly just makes sense. It was weird that it worked the other way before. Now with that, we do see some changes to the Pariah Nexus mission set. I have a whole series of videos from last week discussing the intricacies of the Pariah Nexus missions and talking about their mission rules and special abilities. Some of these cards have been updated in the Pariah Nexus Tournament Companion. Now technically, these only come into play if you're planning to play in Pariah Nexus tournaments. If you're playing Pariah Nexus casually, you do not need to use these changes, but I would recommend that you do because it helps standardize the format and it helps you prepare for tournaments in which you would use these alterations. First of all, recover assets can't be chosen as a fixed secondary. That's probably good. This would have been extremely common. It's a pretty easy secondary to complete if you're planning for it. I almost wonder if making this usable as a fixed secondary was a typo or something. Other similar objectives within the format can't be chosen as fixed secondaries, and the document is very clear that it's not supposed to have the fixed mission icon on the card. Assassination has been clarified to score off of individual character models, not character units. Cull the Horde has been updated. It now scores based on the unit size that was paid for at list construction rather than the actual size of unit played in the game. Because most units have an optional unit size available to them, for example, a unit can be taken in a size of between 10 and 20 models, but if you take that larger unit size, you're paying for all 20 models, you don't get an incremental points increase. It is technically legal to play 19 out of the 20 models and just pay for all 20. This would have made the Cull the Horde secondary way less powerful because armies taking large numbers of infantry, for example, could simply take slightly less efficient efficient units by reducing their unit size by 1 or 2 in order to dodge the unit size necessary to score Cull the Horde off of them. Honestly, I don't know if it was the biggest deal in the world if you could knowingly hamstring yourself in order to dodge this secondary, but it felt maybe a little bit counterintuitive and unintentional, so this smooths it over. Now, last but certainly not least, Hidden Supplies has a clause added, which I'm surprised wasn't on the card because this was also an issue in the Leviathan format, where it can be played on missions where all 4 table corners are within a player's deployment zone. That's actually extremely common since many of the deployments do that. Now it's been clarified that the players roll off to choose the direction that the new objectives are moved in when they're spawned. This is the resolution that basically every event format used when resolving this mission rule, and it's kind of hilarious that they didn't print it on the original card because it just doesn't tell you what to do if you're playing it in a format like that. And with that, those are most of the core rules changes in Pariah Nexus. There are a lot of additional red marks in the core updates document. Most of those are for mechanics that have either just been clarified and have no changes, or changes that were made in previous editions of the rules commentary and have just been moved to the core updates section and don't actually represent any mechanical changes. That said, there are a trillion changes to the game. Many factions have had slight rewrites and slight redesigns, as well as minor FAQs. So if you have any important ones that I didn't cover, go ahead and throw them down in the comment section and let me know what you think about these changes and this new season. And with that, I'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks everyone for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.